The desert had always felt vast, but never had it seemed so merciless. Heat waves shimmered on the horizon as if the earth itself were breathing. The sky, once a flawless stretch of blue, had grown restless with rolling clouds that darkened like bruises across the heavens. Wind whistled low and sharp, pulling at the hem of her dress, stinging her eyes with grit. She squinted against it, one hand shielding her face, the other clutching the small satchel slung across her shoulder, the only thing she had managed to bring when she set out on this reckless journey. At first, she had welcomed the desert's silence. It was a quiet unlike any other, a silence that seemed to purify the air, stripping away the clutter of her thoughts. But silence could turn on you. Silence could become a warning. And now, as the wind gathered strength and the sand shifted in restless spirals at her feet, she felt that silence break, reshaped into the low growl of a storm preparing to strike. She had been warned not to travel alone. The traders she'd passed 3 days earlier had told her of the desert's moods, of sudden tempests that rose without mercy, swallowing up the unprepared. She had smiled politely, grateful for their advice, but secretly dismissive. She thought she could manage. She thought she could outpace whatever the desert threw her way. She was wrong. The horizon darkened further, jagged streaks of lightning flickering in the distance like a blade testing its edge. A wall of dust rose, from the far side of the plain, thick as smoke, moving with frightening speed. She felt her chest tighten. The storm was not coming. It was here. Her boots sank deeper into the softening sand as she pushed forward, searching desperately for anything, a boulder, a cave, even a stand of stubborn scrub that might shield her from the fury racing toward her. But the land stretched flat and merciless, endless in all directions, as though the desert itself had conspired against her. The first lash of wind struck hard, nearly knocking her from her feet. Sand tore across her skin like needles. She dragged, her shawl up over her mouth and nose, breathing through the thin fabric as her eyes watered from the sting. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but to where? The storm had already swallowed the horizon. She could no longer see the faint trail she had been following. She stumbled, nearly fell, and righted herself with a sharp gasp. Fear clawed at her chest, more suffocating than the sand choking the air. She was utterly alone, or so she thought. Through the shifting veil of dust, a shape emerged. At first, she believed it was a mirage, the desert's cruel trick, conjured by her desperation. A shadow rising where none should be, taller than a man, steady against the raging wind. Then came the faint sound of hooves striking hard ground, rhythmic, purposeful. Carrying closer, her heart thudded, torn between relief and terror. Friend? Stranger? Or something far worse? The figure grew clearer. A horse, dark against the storm, muscles rippling as it pressed forward through the sand. Upon its back sat a rider, straight-backed and unshaken by the chaos tearing at the earth. His long hair streamed behind him in the wind, and across his chest glinted the faint shine of leather and beads. He was no mirage. He was real. And he was watching her. For a heartbeat, she froze, unable to move, caught by the sharpness of his gaze even through the storm's haze. There was nothing of hesitation in his eyes. No question of whether she belonged here, whether she deserved help. Only decision, swift and sure. The horse surged forward, carrying him closer. She staggered back a step, her pulse hammering, but her legs had little strength left to flee. The storm screamed louder, wrapping them both in its fury, but the rider reached out an arm strong, steady, commanding. And in that moment, with the world dissolving into wind and sand around her, she realized that her only chance of survival lay not in resisting, but in trusting the stranger who had appeared out of the storm like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to speak. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at her shawl, biting her skin raw with sand. She struggled to see, one arm raised against the grit. But even through the storm's fury, she could not look away from him. The rider cut through the tempest as though it bowed to him. His horse, a powerful bay, kept steady footing despite the shifting dunes, its eyes wide but unflinching. The man atop it was a silhouette of command-broad shoulders, long hair caught by the wind, and movements as fluid as the desert's own rhythm. Every line of him spoke of strength carved from survival, a figure who did not fear the storm because he had lived within it his whole life. She wanted to call out, but the words died in her throat, stolen by the wind. The only sound that carried between them was the thunder of hooves striking the hardpan beneath the sand. In moments he was upon her. The horse stopped so close she could feel the heat radiating from its flank, its muscles taut and coiled. The rider looked down at her, eyes sharp beneath the shadow of his brow. They were dark as obsidian, yet alive, with something fierce, something that made her pulse stumble. She couldn't read his expression. Was it suspicion? Pity? Or something else entirely? His voice cut through the storm, low but commanding. Words she didn't understand at first, the cadence strong, carrying the weight of his people's tongue. When her confusion showed, he repeated himself in halting English. "You will die here." The bluntness stole her breath. She wanted to protest, to insist she could manage, but one glance at the swirling wall of dust around them told the truth. She was already beaten. Her legs trembled beneath her. Her lungs ached with each breath. She wouldn't survive another hour of this storm. His hand extended, palm firm and steady, an unspoken order rather than an invitation. She hesitated. World had taught her caution, especially with strangers, especially with men who appeared suddenly from the wilderness with a gaze that could both command and unsettle. But the storm shrieked louder, flinging sand against her skin until she thought it would flay her alive. Her choices were stark and merciless. Trust him, or vanish into the storm. Her fingers trembled as she reached for him. The moment their hands met, the world shifted. His grip was strong, steadying her with effortless power. In one swift motion, he pulled her upward. She landed against the broad leather of his saddle, pressed close to the heat of his chest as the horse shifted beneath them. The storm closed around them, roaring its fury, but he was unshaken. He urged the horse forward, guiding it with confidence through terrain she could no longer see. Every muscle of his body moved in rhythm with the beast, his strength encircling her, anchoring her against the chaos. For the first time since the sky had darkened, she could breathe. Still, her mind raced. Who was he? Why had he helped her instead of leaving her to the storm, as he easily could have? She dared a glance upward, studying him through the veil of sand and shadow. His features were cut sharp, weathered by sun and hardship, yet striking in a way that made her chest tighten. Beads and leather straps adorned his clothing pieces that were not decoration, but history, each telling a story she could not yet understand. She found her voice at last, hoarse and uncertain. "Where are you taking me?" His eyes flicked to her, then back to the storm ahead. For a long moment, he didn't answer. When he did, his voice was quiet but firm. Shelter. The word carried more weight than its simplicity suggested. It was a promise, not just of protection from the storm, but of something deeper, something she couldn't name. She clutched the saddle horn with one hand, her other still caught in his grasp. And as the horse surged onward into the heart of the storm, she realized she no longer feared the desert's wrath. What unsettled her now was the man who had emerged from it. The storm did not relent. It screamed across the desert like a beast unchained, clawing at the earth, swallowing everything in its path. Yet in the saddle, pressed against the warrior's chest, she felt a strange steadiness. His heartbeat was firm against her back. His arm braced around her, keeping her secure even as the horse fought against the gale. Time blurred into a haze of sound and motion. She clung to the leather strap in front of her, but it was his grip that truly held her fast, guiding her through the chaos. His confidence unsettled her as much as it reassured her. He rode as though the storm were nothing more than a curtain to be parted. As though he could see paths where she saw only death. At last, he slowed. She lifted her head, blinking grit from her lashes, and realized the air had grown less violent. The howl of the wind dulled, muffled by something solid. Ahead, the canyon walls rose high and jagged, dark stone carved by centuries of storms like this one. The entrance had been invisible from the open plain, hidden until they were almost upon it. He guided the horse inside, the storm's fury cut off by rock. The sudden stillness was startling. Sand no longer flayed her skin. She could breathe without choking. She exhaled shakily, only now realizing how tight her chest had been. The canyon was narrow but deep, its walls curving into a shelter shaped by time itself. Near the base, an overhang jutted outward, forming a natural alcove where the horse could rest and where they could escape the storm's reach entirely. He dismounted with practiced ease, then turned to her. "Down," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of command. She hesitated, suddenly aware of how close they were, of how easily he could lift her if she failed to move. His hand rose again, not demanding, not rough, but firm, steady. With his help, she slid from the saddle, her boots hitting the hard ground beneath. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and for a moment she nearly collapsed. But his hand lingered at her elbow, holding her upright until she found her balance. The horse snorted, stamping once as though relieved to be out of the storm. He patted its neck, whispering something in his own tongue that carried like a prayer. Only then did he turn to her again. "You are safe here," he said. The words struck her deeper than she expected. Safe. It had been a long time since. She'd felt that. She pulled her shawl from her face, coughing softly, wiping the grit from her lips. The storm still raged just beyond the canyon's mouth, its roar echoing faintly down the stone walls. She glanced toward it, then back at him. He stood tall and unmoved, the storm no more threatening to him than a passing rain. Why? Why help me? The question slipped out before she could stop it. He looked at her for a long moment, unreadable. His face was carved with the stoicism of someone who had seen too much, who carried burdens she could not guess. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost reluctant. No one should die in the storm. Simple words, yet heavy with meaning. She wanted to press, to ask more, but something in his gaze warned her against it. This was not a man who gave away his heart easily. Instead, she sank to the ground beneath the sheltering overhang, her body aching with weariness. He busied himself with the horse, removing its bridle, checking its hooves, his movements efficient and practiced. There was grace in the way he worked, a quiet strength that made her wonder how many storms like this he had survived. When he finally joined her by the wall, silence stretched between them. It was not an empty silence, but one thick with unspoken things, the storm's fury outside, the fragility of her survival, the mystery of the man who had pulled her from death's grasp. She studied him from the corner of her eye. His profile was strong, his hair falling in dark strands over his shoulders, his jaw set with the hardness of a man shaped by struggle. There was something untamed about him, as though he belonged to the desert as much as the storm itself. And here she was, a stranger who had stumbled into his world, pulled to safety not by chance but by his choice. She folded her arms around herself, not entirely from the chill, but from the unsettling realization that her fate now rested within this canyon, within the hands of the Apache warrior who had become her shelter. The canyon breathed differently than the open desert. The stone walls held the sound of the storm at bay, turning the furious howl into a muted roar. Here, under the rocky overhang, the air was calmer, yet still heavy with grit and the tang of lightning. She sat with her back against the wall, drawing in slow, shallow breaths as if afraid of breaking the fragile stillness that had settled. Between them, he moved with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged to this land. From the satchel strapped to his horse, he retrieved flint, a small pouch, and a bundle of dried brush. His motions were deliberate, efficient, as though he had repeated them 1,000 times. In moments, he coaxed a spark to life, shielding it with his broad hands until flame caught. The glow illuminated his features, casting them in shifting light and shadow. She watched him, silent, uncertain. The storm still thundered outside, but it was the silence inside the canyon that pressed on her more heavily. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but charged like the pause before lightning strikes. The fire grew, crackling softly as warmth pushed back the chill of the storm. Its light painted the stone walls amber, reflecting in his eyes. He sat across from her, cross-legged, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp, as though he never truly rested. For a long time, neither of them spoke. She told herself it was exhaustion that kept her still, but in truth, it was his presence. He radiated something more powerful than the storm outside, a self-possession she had never seen in another man. Finally, she cleared her throat, her voice hoarse. "Do you always ride into storms to rescue foolish strangers?" One corner of his mouth lifted not quite a smile, but close. "No. Then why me?" She pressed, surprised at her own boldness. His gaze lingered on her, steady and unreadable. "Because you were there." The simplicity of the answer struck her harder than she expected. No hidden motive, no expectation. Just truth. Yet behind it, she sensed something more, an instinct, perhaps, that he did not care to explain. She looked down at her hands, brushing sand from her skin, trying to steady herself. But the weight of his stare drew her back, pulling her into the silence between them. The fire popped, a shower of sparks rising and dying in the cool air. He leaned slightly closer to tend the flame, and for the first time, she noticed the details of him not blurred by storm or shadow. The long lines of muscle beneath his shirt, the scars etched across his forearms, the beaded necklace at his throat that glinted faintly in the firelight. Each mark, each piece, seemed to tell a story. She wanted to ask, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she said softly, "You don't fear the storm." His eyes met hers, dark and unwavering. "The storm is the desert. You do not fight it. You move with it, or it breaks you." She nodded slowly, the wisdom in his words pressing into her chest. She had fought everything, her past, her grief, the emptiness that had driven her into this wasteland. And it had nearly broken her. "You move with it," she echoed, more to herself than to him. Silence fell again, but this time it was different. The air between them had shifted, grown taut. Every flicker of the fire seemed to magnify the space they shared, drawing it tighter. She became acutely aware of the closeness, the way his steady breathing filled the small shelter, the subtle scent of leather and smoke that clung to him, the heat radiating not from the fire but from the man himself. Her pulse quickened. She folded her arms around her knees, trying to contain the restless energy thrumming through her. He did not move closer, did not reach for her, yet his presence filled every inch of her awareness. It was as though the canyon itself had conspired to press them together, to strip away all distractions until only the storm, the fire, and the two of them remained. When at last he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Rest. The storm will pass by dawn." She wanted to obey. Her body was heavy with exhaustion, her eyes stung with grit, but sleep felt impossible with him so near. She could only nod, shifting slightly to lean against the wall, the fire's glow warming her skin out as she closed her eyes. One thought refused to fade. It wasn't the storm that unsettled her now, it was the silent fire burning between them. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting the canyon in a softer light. Outside, the storm still howled, but here its fury felt distant, like the memory of an old wound. She sat curled close to the warmth, her eyes half-lidded, yet her mind restless. Sleep teased her but never came. It was not the storm that kept her awake. It was him. The Apache warrior sat opposite her, his broad shoulders relaxed, his gaze fixed on the fire. He hadn't spoken in what felt like hours, but she had the uncanny sense that silence was his truest language. He didn't fidget. He didn't shift. He simply was still, solid, immovable, like the canyon walls around them. At last, she couldn't bear it. "Do you ever speak?" she asked softly, "or do you prefer the silence?" His eyes flicked toward her, catching the firelight. For a moment, she feared she had offended him, but then he said, "Silence tells more than words." She tilted her head, studying him. "And what does it tell you about me?" His gaze lingered on her, steady and unflinching. The weight of it made her breath hitch. "That you are running." Her stomach tightened. She opened her mouth to protest, but the denial died before it formed. His words were too sharp, too certain. She looked down at her hands instead, fingers curling into her skirt. "You don't know me," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "But I know the look in your eyes. I've seen it in others." And in the mirror, she lifted her gaze then, startled. His expression had not changed, still calm, still unreadable, but something flickered in his voice, something heavier than the storm outside. "What did you run from?" she asked before she could stop herself. For a long time, he said nothing. The fire crackled, and the wind's distant roar filled the canyon's hollow spaces. She thought he might refuse, that he would retreat into silence again. But then his eyes dropped to the flames, and his voice came low, measured, carrying a weight that stilled her. "My people," he said slowly, "have been hunted, driven from our lands, forced into cages of promises that break with the wind. I fight to keep what is left, to keep the stories alive. But even fighting, there is loss. Too much loss." His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching. He did not look at her. "I lost my brother in the last raid. I lost my mother long before. Each storm takes something. Each silence holds ghosts." Her throat ached at the starkness of his words. No embellishment. No plea for pity. Just truth, raw and heavy. "I'm sorry," she murmured. It felt useless, too small for the weight he carried, but it was all she had. He lifted his eyes to hers then, and for the first time she saw something beneath the steel, a flicker of grief, deep and unhealed. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, shuttered behind the same stoicism that had carried him through the storm. "And you?" he asked quietly. The question struck her like a blow. She swallowed hard, her chest tight. She had spent so long burying her story, carrying it like a stone in her ribs, that speaking it aloud felt dangerous. Yet under his gaze, in the cocoon of firelight and storm, the truth pressed at her lips. "I had a family once," she began, her voice trembling. "A husband. A child. Fever took them both last winter. The house was too quiet after. Too many memories in every corner. I thought if I walked far enough, the silence might stop following me." The words spilled out, raw and broken, and when they were gone, she pressed her hand to her mouth as though she could pull them back. She had not meant to reveal so much. He did not flinch. He did not offer pity. He simply nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion, as if acknowledging the weight of her pain without trying to lessen it. For the first time in months, she felt heard. The fire dimmed lower, leaving only the glow of embers. Outside, the storm began to fade, its rage dwindling to a tired murmur. Yet inside the canyon, a different storm had stirred, quiet, intimate, undeniable. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, but it was not the chill she was guarding against. It was the way his presence unsettled her grief, reshaped it into something unfamiliar. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. By dawn the storm had broken, but its echo lingered in the canyon. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of wet sand and stone, and the desert beyond still lay cloaked in haze. Yet inside the shelter, another storm stirred, quieter, more dangerous. And entirely of their own making. She hadn't slept. Her body was exhausted, but her mind refused rest. Every time her eyes closed, she felt the heat of his nearness, the way his voice had held her grief without judgment, the way his eyes had looked into her as though they could see every fracture. She could still feel his presence even now, though he sat across from her, sharpening a knife with slow, steady strokes. The silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was taut, stretched thin, vibrating with something unspoken. She shifted, drawing her shawl tighter around her, though the chill was gone. "You should eat," he said, not looking up. He gestured to a strip of dried meat he had laid beside the fire. Her stomach clenched at the sight. Hunger gnawed at her, but she hesitated. Accepting it felt intimate in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. Still, she reached for it, her fingers brushing the edge of the bundle he had prepared. "Thank you," she murmured. He gave a short nod, but his eyes remained on the blade in his hand, moving it against the whetstone with quiet precision. The small act of kindness, the ease with which he provided, unsettled her more than the storm had. She had survived months on her own, carrying her pain like a shield, convincing herself she needed nothing from anyone. And yet here, with this man she barely knew, she found herself letting go of her defenses piece by piece. She studied him from across the fire. His hair caught the morning light filtering into the canyon, strands gleaming like obsidian. The beads at his chest shifted slightly with each breath. His hands scarred, strong moved with deadly grace as they worked the blade. There was nothing delicate about him, yet in the quiet, there was gentleness in the way he allowed her space, never crowding her, never demanding that it was dangerous. "You said the storm would pass," she said softly, needing to break the tension. And it did. He looked up then, his eyes locking on hers. "Storms always pass. But they leave marks," her breath caught. She knew he wasn't speaking of weather. For a heartbeat too long, they simply stared at each other. The air between them grew heavier, thick with something she couldn't name. Her pulse thudded in her throat, loud enough she feared he could hear it. She tore her gaze away, staring at the canyon wall. "And what marks will this one leave?" she asked, almost to herself. The sound of metal against stone ceased. She felt, rather than saw, the weight of his attention settle on her again. When he spoke, his voice was low, roughened. "That depends on you?" Her chest tightened. She knew what he meant. The storm had thrown them together, but what lingered now, the pull she felt, the restless heat curling low inside her, that was something else. Something that had nothing to do with chance and everything to do with choice. She pressed her hands together, trying to steady them. Part of her wanted to run, to put distance between herself and this man who threatened to unravel everything she had built to survive. But another part, the part that had leaned unconsciously into his strength during the storm, wanted to stay, wanted to see where this fragile thread between them might lead. The canyon seemed smaller with each breath, the fire warmer, the silence louder. She forced herself to speak, her voice a whisper. "And what do you want me to choose?" His eyes burned into hers, unreadable, steady as the desert itself. Slowly, he set the knife aside, his hands empty now, resting loosely on his knees. "I want nothing you do not freely give," he said. The simplicity of the words, the honesty in them, made her pulse quicken all the more. The storm outside had ended, but inside her, another raged wilder, more consuming. She could feel it pulling her toward him, even as fear tugged her back. For the first time since the fever had taken everything from her, she realized she was alive enough to feel torn, alive enough to want, and that terrified her more than the storm ever had. Morning crept into the canyon with a quiet grace. the kind that comes only after violence. The storm had spent itself, leaving behind a stillness so deep it felt sacred. The desert stretched beyond the canyon mouth, pale and softened by a faint mist. The sand smoothed clean as if the fury of the night before had erased every trace of what came. Before Dot, she stood at the edge of the canyon, her shawl drawn around her shoulders, staring out at the vastness. The air was cooler, touched with the sharpness of new beginnings. Yet her heart felt anything but calm. Behind her, she could hear him moving, the Apache warrior tending to his horse, checking the straps, brushing sand from the animal's hide. His motions were as steady and deliberate as they had been the night before, as though storms and strangers were simply parts of his world, things to be endured and then left behind. But for her, nothing about the night before could be left behind. She turned slightly, watching him as he worked. His profile was carved in sharp lines, softened only by the morning light. There was strength in every movement, but also a quiet weariness, the kind carried by men who had borne too much. He seemed so certain, so rooted to the earth, while she felt like a reed still bent from the wind. "Where will you go now?" she asked, her voice breaking the hush of morning. He did not look at her immediately. He tightened the strap on his horse's saddle, then straightened, turning his dark eyes to hers. "South, to my people." She nodded, her fingers tightening around her shawl. "And me?" The question hung heavy in the air, heavier than the storm's roar had ever been. She hadn't meant to ask it, not aloud, but it had slipped from the place where her fear and her longing collided. His gaze did not waver. "You have your own path." The words struck her like a stone. Of course. He had saved her life, given her shelter, but that did not bind him to her, nor her to him. She had asked for nothing. He had promised nothing. And yet, some foolish part of her had hoped the night's silence, the stories shared, the way his presence had steadied her, meant more than survival. She turned back to the horizon, blinking against the brightness of the rising sun. The desert stretched endless, offering no answers. She thought of the place she had left behind, the house filled with ghosts, the grief that had driven her into exile. Could she go back to that silence now? Could she keep walking aimlessly, carrying her sorrow with no destination? And then there was him. She felt his presence at her back before she heard his footsteps. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, though he did not touch her. Together they stood at the canyon's edge, the silence between them thick with all the words left unsaid. Finally, he spoke. "The desert does not care where you go, only that you move." She turned her head, meeting his gaze. There was no demand in his eyes, no plea, only truth. He would not decide for her. He would not tether her to his path. Her choice was her own, and yet, when she looked at him, she felt something stir inside her that had lain dormant for too long. It was not the desperate grasping of grief, nor the hollow numbness of loss. It was something fragile but alive. Hope. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist. She could walk away, back into the desert's emptiness, carrying her ghosts as she always had. Or she could step toward the unknown, toward him, toward a life she could not yet imagine, one filled with danger and hardship, but also with the promise of something more than silence. Her breath trembled in her chest. The choice loomed before her like the open desert, vast and merciless. And for the first time in months, she realized she wanted to choose. The desert sun had risen fully now, spilling light into the canyon and painting the stone in shades of gold and red. The storm was only a memory, its wreckage erased by the wind. But inside her, another storm lingered, fierce and insistent, demanding to be answered. He stood beside his horse, tightening the last strap on the saddle. His movements were calm, unhurried, as though he had already accepted whatever choice she might make. There was no question in his posture, no expectation. He belonged to the land, to his people, to a life carved by struggle and survival. Whether she walked away or stepped closer would not break him, but it might break her. She watched him, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She thought of the road she had left behind, the empty home, the graves marked in silence, the endless ache of loss that had driven her to wander. If she walked away now, that was what waited for her. A return to silence. A return to ghosts, and then she thought of the night before. The firelight painting his face in shadows. His voice steady as he spoke of storms and scars. The way his hand had held hers in the chaos, strong and sure. When she had been on the edge of surrendering to despair, the shelter he had given her had not only been of stone and fire. It had been something deeper. Her fingers trembled as she drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, stepping closer to him. The sound of her boots against the sand was small, but it felt louder than thunder in her ears. He noticed her approach, his hand pausing on the saddle strap. Slowly, he turned to face her. His eyes met hers, dark and steady, unreadable as always. Yet something flickered there, something quiet, patient, as though he had been waiting all along. "I don't want to walk alone anymore," she said, her voice low but firm. The words felt dangerous to speak, but once they left her lips, she did not regret them. For a moment, he was silent. Then he gave a single nod, not triumphant, not surprised, but certain, like a man acknowledging what the desert had already decided. "You understand," he said softly. "My path is not easy. It is war and exile. It is blood and dust." "I understand," she whispered, though she knew she could not truly fathom the weight he carried. All she knew was that her own path, the one behind her, had been its own kind of death. With him, at least, there was life, raw, unrelenting, uncertain, but alive. He studied her for another heartbeat, as though testing the truth of her resolve. Then, slowly, he extended his hand, the same hand that had pulled her from the storm, the same hand that had steadied her when she nearly collapsed. She looked at it, her pulse racing, then placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and sure, and something in her chest broke open. It was not the canyon that had sheltered her. It was not the fire. It was him. For the first time since she had buried her family, she felt something beyond grief. Not certainty, not safety. Those were illusions the world rarely allowed. But she felt belonging, fragile and fierce, in the arms of the man who had carried her through the storm. The horse shifted, snorting softly, impatient to move. He released her hand only long enough to mount, then extended it again, waiting for her. She placed her foot in the stirrup, and with his strength pulling her up, she settled behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist. The desert stretched endless before them, but she no longer feared it. Whatever storms lay ahead, she had found her shelter. She pressed her cheek against his back, closed her eyes, and let the rhythm of the horse's gait carry her forward. The storm had taken much, but in its fury it had also given her something she had thought lost forever, not just survival, not just hope. Home.